Eventually, Napoleon went too far. Eventually, Adolf Hitler was defeated. It's like, and I just think verse 17 is such a great reminder, like when we despair and we're like, oh no, the proverbial Huns are coming. Oh no, Attila the Hun, the proverbial whatever. God's reminder is like, listen, you look at history, nobody is allowed to go unchecked forever. Everybody is stopped eventually when I decide that they've crossed, when they've reached that point where I'm done with them.
Yeah, and if you simplify chapter 2 down, that's essentially what he's saying. All of this was for vanity anyway, because Babylon is going to be destroyed by the Persians. So that's a great point. Any other comments before we move into chapter 2? All right, let's look at the first part of chapter 2 here. We'll read these first couple of verses, and then we'll get into a theme that develops starting in verse 5. I feel like chapter 2 probably should have started in verse 2 because Habakkuk is still speaking in verse 1. I feel like that should have been the end of chapter 1, but let Habakkuk finish here in verse 1. I will stand my watch, and I will set myself on the rampart, and I will watch to see what he will say to me, and what I will answer when I am corrected. So Habakkuk is saying, now I'm going to wait on God's response. Let's see what he says. That's basically what's happening here in verse 1. And so in verse 2, the Lord is going to begin his answer. So somebody read the first part of God's response here in verses 2 through 4.
Then the Lord answered me and said, record the vision and inscribe it on tablets, that the one who reads it may run. For the vision is yet far the appointed time. It hastens toward the goal, and it will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it, for it will certainly come. It will not delay. Behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, and the righteous will live by his faith.
Okay, so kind of breaking down God's kind of introduction to his coming response here. Basically, in verses 2 and 3, he's saying, get ready because I'm about to give you an answer. Write this down. I'm giving you an answer. Make it very plain. And I found it interesting in trying to research what this meant in verse 2, and there's kind of some conflicting thoughts as to what this means, but make it plain, write it down, that he may run who reads it. So kind of two main themes I ran across when trying to figure out what this means. Whoever gets the message, that they may run who read it. There's basically two different thoughts. It could be either we're making this message so large and easy to read that one running by could see it, or I took the second one to make a little bit more sense to me, that you're essentially excited about good news and you're going to run with this good news. You're going to take it and run with it. That kind of a thought. But God is saying, get ready. Here's my answer. Write it down. And then verse 3 is really God saying, it's going to happen at my appointed time. So it's going to happen. It may not happen immediately, but I've got an appointed time for all these things to happen. So with that kind of being kind of our intro, setting up God's response, any thoughts or comments there at the beginning?
Always wondered where wait for it came from. Wait for it.
Right. Yes.
God said it.
Exactly.
Well, Habakkuk is being encouraged to just do what he is supposed to do. I really like verse 1 also. I think Habakkuk, in spite of his hesitation in chapter 1, I do think he is having the attitude that he is supposed to have, which is, I don't understand something, I am frustrated by something, but all I can do is stand at the guard post where I'm supposed to be and wait for God to answer. And I appreciate that Habakkuk doesn't say, well, I'm going to come up with an answer for God. I'm going to put words in God's mouth. I'm going to make assumptions, jump to conclusions. He says, I'll stand at the guard post and I'll wait. And God confirms that by saying in verse 4, the righteous one needs to live by faith. You stay at your guard post, do what you can do what you're supposed to do, and just trust me.
Right. Yes, I think that's a great point. And we'll get into verse 4 a little bit later. I'm sure John could have predicted that. That's one of my applications at the end, so we'll talk about that more. I will comment just quickly on that first part. Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him. There were some kind of differences of opinions between different commentators on whether or not the proud there is speaking of the proud people of Judah and their sin, or whether it's talking about Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. But the point remains the same. The proud are one way, but the just need to live by faith. And so now he's going to get into his answer here about Babylon. And he's going to begin a series of woes. So he's going to pronounce a series of 5 woes to come against the Babylonians. And so I want to start with the first 2. So let's get into the first 2, and really let's just take one at a time. Somebody read the first woe for us, which is going to be verses 5, and if you'll read 5 through 8, and we'll get to the first woe.
Indeed, because he transgresses by wine, he is a proud man. He does not stay at home. Because he enlarges his desire in hell, and he is like death and cannot be satisfied, he gathers to himself all nations and heaps up for himself all people. Will not all these take up a proverb against him, and a haunting riddle against him, and say, Woe to him who increases what is not his? How long? And to him who loads himself with many pledges, will not your creditors rise up suddenly? Excuse me. Will they not awaken to oppress you? And you will become their booty, because you have plundered many nations. All the rampart of the people shall plunder you, because of men's blood and the violence of the land and the city, and of all who dwell in it.
Okay, so our first woe here, woe to him who increases what is not his. And that makes perfect sense when talking about Babylon. And we see that quite a bit in chapter 2. It's this theme of they were constantly going around destroying other nations, taking what was not theirs, just to expand their empire. It's a very common theme in history. Leaders who become very powerful, seeking to grow their borders, take from others, and this was all vanity anyway, because Babylon was going to come to an end pretty quickly in the following century. So, woe to him who increases what is not his. There's kind of some interesting ideas here in verse 6. This taunting riddle, this idea that many seem to think that this is speaking of the former nations that the Babylonians have conquered are now going to taunt Babylon once they are destroyed, because the Babylonians are essentially going to reap what they sow. They're going to kind of get the same thing. When the Persian Empire grows and becomes more powerful, takes over Babylon, then these former nations conquered by Babylon will taunt them. And then verse 8 seems to be kind of that prophecy of those who were going to destroy Babylon eventually. So eventually a remnant of people is going to plunder you because of violence and because of men's blood.
What goes around comes around.
Exactly. Yes. That's the idea that we see here. Any ideas on this first woe that was pronounced? Let's move to the second one, verses 9 through 11, kind of a shorter section there. Somebody read that, 9 through 11.
Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. You have devised a shameful thing for your house by cutting off many people, so you are sinning against yourself. Surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework.
Okay, so here we have the second woe. Woe to him who covets evil gain for his house. So I find that very similar to the first woe, that this same idea that the Babylonians were coveting what was around them. They were taking from others. It was described as sinful and shameful, but they did that, verse 9, that he may set his nest on high. So you just have pride here, wanting to grow, wanting to increase borders, wanting to increase wealth, and doing that at the cost of others, and doing it because of covetousness, verse 9. So woe to him who covets evil gain for his house. Any thoughts there on that second woe?
And I think even in a sense, verse 11 is saying that our possessions kind of are personified here as crying out against us. Like the things that you steal, whether it's the gold that Achan hid under his tent,
Right.
or it's Abel's righteous blood crying out from the ground, like these are inanimate things that are given kind of human qualities. Well, like when you build a house out of stone with rafters that are stolen from other people, like your house itself cries out against you.
Taking wood from Lebanon.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a great point. So woe to him who covets evil gain for his house. All right, let's get into these final three woes. So the next one, if somebody could read our third one, 12 through 14.
Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts that people's labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea.
Okay, so how did they build their town?
Violence.
It was built on violence. It was built on bloodshed, taking from people around them, killing mercilessly. Woe to him who establishes a city by iniquity. Behold, it is not of the Lord of hosts that the people labor to feed the fire. So these are all things that are going to be destroyed. And how does he describe that? Look at the end of verse 13. They weary themselves in vain. This is all vanity. This is not an empire that's going to last for many more centuries. It was an empire that was coming to an end. This is all done in vain, but it was built on bloodshed. So kind of a lesson for these people to learn. And then our fourth woe is going to speak to how they treated nations around them. Could somebody read verses 15 through 17?
Woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom, even to make them drunk, so as to look on their nakedness. You will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. Now you yourself drink and expose your own nakedness. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will come upon your glory. For the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and the devastation of its beasts by which you terrified them, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town and all its inhabitants.
All right, I found this woe interesting and maybe even a little bit difficult to understand, this idea of giving your neighbor intoxicating drink. But when doing a little bit of research here, it was a lot of people speaking of Babylon. They were trying to use kind of the metaphor of alcohol here to talk about how Babylon would exploit their neighbor, almost like you trick someone into getting drunk so that you can do what you will with them. And that's kind of the thought that they had about the surrounding nations. They were going to exploit them. They were going to do what they could to get what they want, and then to rob them dry. So woe to him who does that. And then there's some reference there in verse 17 to what they would end up doing to Lebanon, and then of course we know what Nebuchadnezzar does to the city of Tyre. But that's how they treated their neighbors, not treating them well, rather looking for opportunity to exploit them, as one would do with someone that tricks them into getting drunk, so that you can take advantage of that type of person. Any thoughts anyone had here reading this fourth woe?
Yeah, history definitely shows that too, because the Medes and the Scythians and the Persians all allied with the Babylonians against Assyria. But then the Medes, the Persians, and the Scythians all rebelled against the Babylonians 50 years later. So it's like Babylon got all these buddies together and said, hey, we got to get rid of these Assyrian guys. And it was like, yeah. And, they got, according to the metaphor, got them drunk, used them to fight the Assyrians, and then, didn't give them the freedoms in their country or whatever it was that the Persians and the Medes would have wanted. But they did the same thing to Josiah. Josiah, the reason why Josiah fought against Pharaoh Necho was because he assumed that if he got on Babylon's good side, that it would be advantageous for Judah. And I'm sure that Babylon was like, you want to go ahead and stop Pharaoh Necho before he gets to Carchemish, you go right ahead. It'd be really great if you did that. And then where was Babylon when Judah needed it? They weren't there, and they took them over.
Yeah, that's a great point. So luring their neighbors in with intoxication and the lust of power, just to exploit them. That was that fourth woe. All right, the fifth and final woe here that we see in chapter 2, probably the most well-known. We've got a very well-known passage in here in reference to idolatry. So could somebody finish out chapter 2 for us and read verses 18 through 20?
What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped metal image for the teacher of wise? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. And this teach, behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. But the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth be silent.
Okay. Idolatry and crafting idols. This is one of the most absurd and illogical sins, yet it's one that ancient man seemed most prone to commit. And a lot of that has to do with just influence of neighboring countries and how prevalent idolatry was all around them. So, of course, the Babylonians are practicing idolatry. Woe to them. But also, look at all the other minor prophets. Woe to Judah for doing the same thing. But that verse 19, one we know well, it's so silly, it's so absurd to craft something out of wood and tell it to awake, to craft something out of stone and tell it to arise, telling these things made of gold to speak. It's absurd, but that's what the people were practicing. So in contrast to that, what you should do is verse 20. Recognize where the true God is in his holy temple and let all the earth keep silence before him. So I won't expound on that too much since that's also in my applications, but that concept of having reverence before the Lord, that's what the people lacked. They were so influenced by the idolatry around them. Isaiah and Jeremiah also speak of the absurdity of idolatry. I'm thinking specifically of kind of this long passage on idolatry that Isaiah speaks of in chapter 40, starting in verse 18. But also Jeremiah as well. Jeremiah in chapter 50 speaks of Judah being the land of idolatry, and they're insane with their idols. They're driven mad by their idols. So this is a concept that is on the thought of many of these prophets. Any comments there about that? Woe to those practicing idolatry. Go ahead.
Verse 18 is just one of my favorite because it's just so silly. Like you said, when you think, someone who speaks and thinks is making something who doesn't speak and think and asking you to rule their life.
Right.
It's just, yeah.
Yeah, they
It's
become
so powerful, that verse 18.
They become so convinced that that's the way to access your God. They're so convinced by all the idolatry around them that they're driven to absurdity, and as Jeremiah described it, as insanity. Any other thoughts, Kevin?
It reminded me of one of the other passages where he says, not here, but the other prophet, when he says, you chop down wood, and with some of it you put in the fire, and with the rest of it you bow down before it.
Yeah.
It's like, right. Like it's the same tree, you just cut it down, and I think for us, it does seem really silly, or stupid, why on earth would you do that? Why would you go, chop down, a tree and then, use some of it from your fireplace and then bow down to worship, the other part of it. And I think just like in our modern society, we don't understand the way they viewed these idols and these figurines and such. Like it just had a very different perspective on what that represented to them. It's just, I think just for us, so yeah, for us, I mean, it's still silly no matter which way you cut it. I mean, to them, it should have been silly as well.
Yeah.
For us, I think it's, the way that they view the representation of deity, and that you can form it and you can carry that deity around with you. It's something physical that you can hold, and that represents that deity or power, whatever. It's something that we just have a hard time connecting with. Like that
today in Catholicism with saints, like they'll have certain saints that I know, a friend of mine, when she bought a new house, turned a saint upside down and buried it in the ground. That means your house will be blessed.
Right.
I mean, there's certain things that I think we have, you know, society today still does.
Yeah.
That is a worship of idols. Well, and of course we all have our idols that take priority over God, but
Yeah, that's
as
a
far as
big,
figurines go, I think there are still, today,
yeah,
in
there's still
quote, the
some,
Christian
right,
walk.
definitely some superstitions there.
Yeah.
As well, yes.
Yeah, if you boil it down to just, if idolatry is like the embodiment of humans being ridiculous, well then there's ridiculousness in all human ages. I think these same people who worship idols would look at us today on, we're so silly. Well, we're watching a fireworks show, and what do? We're recording it on our cell phones. Instead of just watching a fireworks show, we're watching it on the screen. They look at us and go, "You guys are so silly. You're watching TV on a beautiful summer day instead of being outside. You're so silly." You know, it's like every age of man has ridiculous, silly things that we prioritize over what is true and substantial. And if their problem was idols, we've got a lot of problems ourselves.
Right, I agree.
Well, we've done that through history in the last 50 years with ball players, what have you.
Treating them like idols.
We do.
Yeah.
Many do.
Right.
And Jacob, I think he hammers it home in verse 20 though. He says, but the Lord God is in his holy, God is in heaven reigning. He doesn't need anything from us, but we need everything from him. And,
Yeah.
you know, we should honor him and have submission and reverence when he says, let the earth keep silence before
Right,
him.
and he was not crafted out of wood or stone. All right, let's get into chapter 3.
I've heard verse 20 quoted so many times in my life.
Yeah.
And
Good
it just
song.
shows, and verse 20 was true from, the beginning of time with Adam and Eve. But the time of Habakkuk still today, and will be true until the coming of Christ.
Exactly.
And it
One of
just
those
shows
all-time truths.
the reverence that we should have before God. And he's the one that we should be bowing down to.
Right.
And that we should bow down to him.
Right.
Like in our prayers or whatever. But
Yeah.
It just shows the reverence we should have.
I agree. Let's look at chapter 3. So the Lord is done with his answer. And then in chapter 3, we're going to end Habakkuk with the prophet's prayer. We're not going to take the time to read. I don't think we have time to read all of chapter 3. So we'll just kind of look at a couple sections really quickly as we bring class to a close. But I want to start with the first 2 verses. The prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet on Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard your speech. I was afraid. O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. So he's starting off here. We're kind of setting up the idea that this is going to be something poetic, something even musical. Y'all notice something kind of on the right side of a few of these verses that you may have seen somewhere else, denoting music? What do you notice? Right. Where have we seen that? All throughout the Psalms. And so kind of the idea here that Habakkuk's prayer may have even been kind of read along to music. There's like a musical concept here going on. A lot of people don't really understand in verse 1 what that Shigionoth is. There's some people, some commentators will just straight up say, there's no way of knowing what this means. Other commentators think it has to do with music or the literary style that this chapter is going to be written, but a lot of confusion there. But it's pretty evident that this is very musical in nature, this chapter. So he is saying, essentially, Lord, your will be done there in verse 2. Revive your works, make it known, your will is going to be done, and he's going to start this psalm. So the first part here, if you start in verse 3, and we're not going to take the time to read it, but in verses 3 through 15, look at a couple of the themes that you can see here. So first of all, talking about the Lord's terrifying approach and how awesome and how mighty the Lord is. You can see a few things like verse 4, rays are flashing from his hand, power. And in verse 5, before him went pestilence, and after him followed fever followed at his feet. Verse 7, he is afflicting the tents of Cushan. The curtains of the land of Midian are trembling. So he's going in and he's talking about the Lord's power. So in other words, if you think Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon are powerful, wait till you see what the Lord is capable of. So the Lord is very powerful. In verses 8 through 15 here, he's going to ask what seems like perhaps a rhetorical question, but he's going to get into the answer. So asking the question, Lord, were you displeased with the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea that you rode on horses, your chariots of salvation? So asking, Lord, are you angry with nature? But then he kind of gets into the answer. And the answer, it seems, in verses 9 through 15 is no, but in fact, the Lord will often use nature and use things in nature for his purposes. Talking about dividing the earth and the rivers, the mountains trembling. Verse 11, the sun and the moon standing still. Of course, we remember that from the book of Joshua in verse 10, the sun standing still. But more talking about God's omnipotence, God's great power that Habakkuk is referencing here. So just from that, I know we didn't really read it. We didn't get into it very deeply just because of time. But do you want to have any thoughts on this first part of Habakkuk's song, speaking of God's omnipotence and power? Any observations that you noticed as you read it?
That's that God controls all, and He uses what He needs to carry out His own plan.
He will use people. He will use the Assyrians and the Babylonians for His will. He will use nature for His will. Very good. All powerful. Any other observations?
I think there's a couple of at least allusions to past events.
Yeah.
There, which I think is always appropriate.
Yeah, some specific references like judgment brought to Cush and to Midian, and then possibly verse 11 referencing what happened in Joshua.
Exodus 14, verse 15.
You walked through the sea with your horses, through the heap of the great waters. All right, and then our last little bit here, I really like this last part, so I do want someone to read this. Somebody just go through maybe just the last three verses. Look at 17 through 19. Somebody please read 17 through 19.
So the fig tree should not blossom, nor the fruit be on the vine. The produce of the olive fail, and the field yields no food. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Thou, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer. He makes me tread on my high places. To the choirmaster with stringed instruments.
Okay, I think we have a pretty interesting character arc from Habakkuk throughout this book. I think it's very neat to see how Habakkuk almost changes a little bit throughout the story here. So if you recall how we started the book, at the beginning of chapter 1, he's very upset. He's very upset. How long shall I cry and you not hear? How long will I say violence and you will not save? Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? He's very upset about how sinful Judah is. And then he moves on to questioning. So the Lord gives him an answer. He says, don't worry, I'm going to use Babylon to punish Judah. And then Habakkuk moves on to questioning. Well, why them? They're pretty terrible too. Why them? And then the Lord comes up with his response to that. And I think we see at the end of the book here, Habakkuk, he's understanding. He moves to a place of understanding. I get it. He says, back up in verse 16, he's willing to rest in the day of trouble. He's at peace with what is happening here. And then this great proclamation of faith in verses 17 and 18. Even if Babylon, and what's happening in verse 17 here is going through like all the different types of sources of food that the Judeans have. It talks about the fig tree and the fruit on the vine and the olive. If all of this fails and there is no food, I will still rejoice in the Lord. No matter what happens, I will rejoice in the Lord. So I found this proclamation of faith at the end of the book here to be very powerful. Any thoughts on that, Tim?
I'll just echo Ryan's lesson this morning that there is a response. The faith. Yeah, you know what, it's gonna be awful, but it doesn't matter, I'm going to trust in God, He is my salvation. 100% exactly what the response should be.
Right. I agree. Right.
In the midst of a lot of metaphor and symbolism, there's a moment of abject literalism that really strikes me in verse 16. When he says, "Behold, I must wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us." Like, just think about that statement.
Yeah.
For the people to arise who will invade us. Like, that is
No more poetry.
There's no poetry there. It is abject, stark literalism. Like, yep, I am going to sit patiently and quietly for our country to be invaded and destroyed.
Right.
It's just,
And it takes a lot of faith to say that and then immediately say, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord."
yeah.
Great faith, I think. Yeah.
I think, the acceptance, maybe some of the things that Ryan talked about this morning, and then also, the comments that we've just seen, Habakkuk just takes acceptance and, realizes the Lord wants to change us, maybe not always our situation. And, we can grow from all of these things, and we can be changed ourselves, our circumstances by God.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Very good. Couple of applications as we bring the class to a close. A couple powerful things from the book of Habakkuk. We'll start in chapter 2 in verse 4. This very profound statement here. This is one of the statements when God is speaking. "Behold the proud, his soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by faith." Have y'all seen that anywhere else in the Bible, that phrase, "the just will live by faith"?
New Testament, Romans.
How about a trick question? It's in the New Testament.
You already know the answer.
No one's trying to trick anybody. Paul used that multiple times, that concept of the just shall live by faith. We also see the Hebrew writer using that as well. So what was the need? Why would Paul need to remind his readers of the concept of the importance of faith? Why did Paul need to use that? It's probably different than why maybe Habakkuk is using it. Why was Paul using it?
He was teaching against righteousness established by works of the law.
Right.
He said, "Just shall live by faith, not by works."
Right. So Paul's using that to combat like these Judaizing teachers who rely too heavily on completing the checklist of what was in the law and lacking faith. That's why Paul uses Habakkuk here. Why did the people in Judah need this concept? Why did they need to live by faith?
Well, they've been trusting way too much in themselves, in their idols, the things they could see, the nations around them. Like trying to plead with Babylon or trying to plead with Egypt. There's always those references. So go down to Egypt because and plead with them. So, and all that focus on the earthly, mechanical things and what you're doing. Like that, you need to stop looking at that and live by faith in God.
Yes, I agree. Yes.
I think Jeremiah is just gonna prophesy pretty soon and tell them something that seems counterintuitive. He's gonna say, go with Nebuchadnezzar, go with Babylon, don't fight it. And that's gonna take a lot of faith for them to trust in that prophet's word. So.
Yes. They were being told in many prophecies about this concept of a remnant who will be brought back. And it was going to take a lot of faith to wait for that moment. Knowing that Babylon is coming and being okay with that takes a lot of faith, I think. Chapter 2.
You realize that God's in control.
Yes, exactly. And that can lead us directly into this next application, that concept of the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him. So that concept of keep silence before him kind of brings to mind that idea of practicing reverence before God. So I want to ask questions, maybe the final thing that we discussed, but what does that look like literally for us today? Or is that just a metaphor? Are we to, in any literal, real way, are we to practice reverence before God? What do you think? How can that be done?
Yeah, reverence in our worship and our prayers. You know, I mean, it says, you know, like in the New Testament, it tells us, you know, go into a closet to pray. You know, I think, you know, being reverent, showing, you know, not being, what I'm trying to say, not being showy about it or whatever, you know, that you're in your own heart, you're being reverent, you know, to God.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I think it's a great point. This could be an entire class. We could talk about this, but having some time set aside to be with God, to be very intentional about that, to block all distractions, to be reverent and to pray and think about God, I think is important. On Wednesday, if you could read a very long book of Haggai, you'll be ready to go for that class. 2 chapters.
Oh, yeah, good job.
It's been quite the whole class, that's bam, right? Are you?
I mean, yeah, but I mean, like,
A lot of people. I mean, we have a lot of needs and a lot
yeah,
of
a lot of
people.
needs, and I'm like, they didn't get it anymore.
And, you know, I probably took too long on the, meals for her, you know. What do you do? What do you do that day?
Okay, but every other day.
2 weeks, but it's like, yeah, every week and a half.
Okay.
Like, it's like,
For the-
it's like a,
Tuesday, Thursday, you mean?
right. So I started out Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then
So I know.
definitely something is going on.
And that's it, it's stuff, I don't know.
Just because one part, I mean,
Okay, okay.
you personally, me personally, don't.
Have you
Okay.
written?
I have kids all the time.
The
reason I do that is because
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, it may not be
Yeah,
anything.
yeah. Okay, so anybody that I need to focus on?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look at that.
Anything that might, like Friday or something, text me.
I think they would let you know, let us know most of the time. I was trying to get a vote.
Yeah.
No, I'm surprised. So I did hear what
Yeah.
It's all real.
You know what? You believe it. Yeah.
So July 31st.
Blood sugar is nonsense today. Oh, that's why.
Well, I
Okay.
haven't gone through this. I can assure you, a lot of things.